Hello, everyone. It's Clay, and I'm sitting across from David.
Hello, hello.
The semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. David, I was just out in Lochsaw Lodge, out in the Bitterroot Mountains at the heart of the Lewis and Clark Trail with 50 of our favorite listeners who gathered from around the United States, even around the world, to come and be part of Humanities Retreats.
Oh, I bet it was a great time.
4 days, 5 really, on Thoreau's Walden, my favorite American book, and then an equal amount of time with a different group of people, with some overlap, on Books of the Road, The Odyssey, Huckleberry Finn, The Grapes of Wrath,
Great.
Travels with Charlie, and Jack Kerouac's
Great.
On the Road. And so these are Jefferson Hour people. If you're interested in these winter retreats at this marvelous snow-covered, pine-forested, retro log lodge west of Missoula, Montana, you can find out more at our website, jeffersonhour.com, and so on. But I do this every year, and it's one of the highlights of my year. But my point is that these are Jefferson Hour people.
Great.
Almost 100% of them are Jefferson Hour people.
Great.
One woman came from, I think, Cincinnati because she had seen me in Ken Burns' The Roosevelts and then found the Jefferson Hour. But here's the thing, David. They all say, when will you get Swenson to come on one of these trips? Does he even exist? They want to meet you. That's my point.
Well, that's really nice.
And it was your idea, as 2016 began, that we do Jefferson 101, that we go back and do what you thought.
Well, we've done this before, but
not in this scale.
This is great. I eat it up. I love it. And this program this week, we what did you call it? The Reluctant Revolution?
The Reluctant Revolutionary.
Right. And I thought we would get through this in a program. I don't think so.
Well, we kind of covered the ground. We left some things out, but
we
my
got
point
them up
is
to about 1776, right?
The metaphor that I'm using is that there's a trajectory of the private, reluctant, but brilliant Jefferson, just wanting to live his life and build Monticello and have children, and suddenly the revolution bites him.
We all know the facts and the figures, or we can find them at the touch of a keyboard, the dates and the timeline. What I find so interesting about these programs is, in talking to you, my understanding of Jefferson the man gets deeper and deeper and deeper, and that I think is the real value in these. That's what I hope people take away from listening to these is who was this guy?
I agree with that, and
he's getting beat up so much nowadays. It just drives me nuts.
Yeah. So there's the view that's held by Joseph Ellis and my old student Joanne Freeman and others and all of the Hamiltonians, that Jefferson was kind of a Machiavellian political mastermind who pretended to just want to be home gardening, that he really was a fiercely ambitious man.
I couldn't live my life if I was that cynical.
I know, but they do hold that view
at
various levels of passion. That's wrong, and this series is...
That's making history a judgment rather than trying to understand it, isn't it?
What we're trying to show here is that Jefferson was a man of extraordinarily wide range of interests and passions and commitments.
Your favorite word, a polymath.
He was a polymath, and he was a Renaissance man, and so for Hamilton, politics is everything, but for Jefferson, politics is just a thing, and it's so different. And so Jefferson really didn't want the revolution. And he would have preferred to stay out of it, and he would have liked to finish Monticello, and he would have liked to stay home. He spent most of his public life in the public arena, but it wasn't his vision of life. It just happened. And he says many times, the revolution came along, and it changed everything. And we had no choice. If you're a smart and able-bodied person of potential, you're going to be drawn into that because everybody has to play his part. And he did. So one of the things that I like in this series is that we're showing that Jefferson is not that Machiavellian political activist. And secondly, we've talked about...
He's more of a geek.
He's kind of geeky. He's, he's thinking about that wine dumbwaiter rather than... But secondly, I think we're putting slavery in its place.
Well, I don't think we have yet, but, and I'm going to need your help on this. I'm going to try to draw it out of you in future programs, but... The very first piece of legislation that Jefferson introduced in Virginia was,
a manumission bill.
Yeah, and explain quickly what that is.
He suggested that worked with a man named Richard Bland, who was a very senior and highly
If you
respected
freed a
guy.
slave in Virginia, that slave had to leave the
Well,
state.
it wasn't
right?
true at that point.
Yeah.
At that point, you just couldn't free slaves without special legislative activity. So Jefferson and Bland, his co-sponsor, wanted to make it possible under careful conditions for slaveholders to free slaves.
Right.
That's all he wanted to do. It wasn't like a genuine emancipation bill or anything. It was just like, can we find a legal mechanism so that we can ease the possibility of people freeing their slaves on a case-by-case basis? That bill was overwhelmingly defeated. Richard Bland, who was the primary sponsor, was denounced by members of the House of Burgesses.
And so was Jefferson.
Jefferson was denounced less. He was spared a little because he was just this young man.
guy, yeah.
But he learned an important lesson.
Then we go to the Northwest Ordinance. What did, in Jefferson's original draft, what was part of that?
No slaves west of the Appalachian Ridge.
So I don't want to get us into an hour-long discussion that's supposed to be an intro, but there's things that
we'll be coming to that.
Yeah.
But my point is that we've been talking about this, and slavery has come up in the first 5 programs,
right.
but it hasn't dominated. And
right.
that's where the problem is now with Jefferson studies, is that slavery has become the sort of...
Well, there are folks...
The tripping point.
I have friends that say, how can you... Jefferson, he was a slaveholder. Done deal. Out,
So that's something that we will be continuing. But here's what I want to do with the
and I get that.
The Declaration of Independence program, which is our next one.
Right.
Here's what I want to do with it.
Okay.
I want to talk. We've done that program in different ways many times. I want to go back through it as a text. We'll quickly lay the groundwork of how he came to write it and so on and so forth.
Some of it's pretty boring to read.
No, but I'm gonna outline the text.
Okay.
And then I have a book called The 4th of July, 1776, and I want to talk about some things that were going on in Philadelphia and the United States while this event was occurring.
Right.
So that'll be the next one.
Look forward to that.
106.
I said before we started recording, I had to sort of admit that I was kind of getting lonesome to talk to the dead president.
It's been too much me and too little Jefferson.
Yeah, I missed that. So, we're
going to interrupt this series a couple of times
sometime
here.
we should be. There's some really good mail that's come in. Great questions, both for you and for Jefferson.
And this letter that I've spoken of before, the one that asks us to talk about if Jenkinson could go back to Jefferson, what 5 questions would I ask? And if Jefferson could come to Jenkinson, what 5 questions would he ask about us? So I want to do that program.
We'll do the Declaration of Independence.
And then we'll take a break.
And then we'll do some Jefferson questions.
And then we'll take a 2 or 3 week break, and then we'll come back and we'll pick up the middle of Jefferson's life. Uh-huh. And then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and pick up.
Not a break. We're gonna go back to the regular format.
Right, and then we'll
let the professor rest.
Then we'll proceed to Jefferson's presidency. Uh-huh. We'll take another little break with some other programs, and then we'll talk about Jefferson and retirement. So we'll probably do 12 programs altogether, or maybe 14 on Jefferson 101.
I have to tell you, I thought this week's was a good one. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for your preparation on it. It's a very interesting subject because if you think of Lenin or Thomas Paine or Robespierre or Marat, these are thirsty, obsessive, ambitious, instinctive revolutionaries who are rabble rousers. They're going to be rabble rousers in any society that they're in. And yet the central figure in our revolution, or certainly one of the 3 or 4 central figures, is a man who was so shy and reluctant that he had no instinct for this sort of thing. His instinct was for order and calm and quiet and farming and minding his own business at Monticello. And so this makes him so interesting to me, David, that he got drawn into this and became a revolutionary, but he was not in any way a man who was born to rebel. So let's listen to this program, Jefferson 105, The Reluctant Revolutionary, taking us from the moment that he was married in 1772 to the moment when he's called upon to write the Declaration of Independence. Thanks for listening, and I think this is now when you appeal for funds.
If you enjoy this program,
I like that tone of voice.
If you do, we want you to know that we appreciate that, and it's only you who can help it to continue. We're not going anywhere, but we do need your support as a listener. It's very easy to support this program. Just go to jeffersonhour.com, click on Donate. If you'd rather mail something in, there are contact information there. And we want you to know that not only do we thank you for listening, we thank you for supporting the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Oh, that was done in that kind of
podcast voice.
Almost smarmy, kind of.
I could do recipes on public radio.
Listeners like you voice.
One cup of.
Do you ever hear the guy who does this? He was on Saturday Night Live. He did the subliminal thing.
Oh yeah.
I
can't do that.
So you just give me another little pitch.
No, it's time for the show next week.
We want $100,000.
Yes, of course.
We want $10,000. Write a fat check.
Thank you very much.
Now's a good time to write that check. You'll be happier. All of your insecurities will be gone.
And we hope you enjoy this week's edition.
You'll find the person of your
Thomas
dreams.
Jefferson Hour.
You'll have a BMW.
And
Success
roll it now.
will follow success. It starts with that $100,000 check. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, brought to you by Bismarck State College on the banks of the Missouri River, at the heart of the Lewis and Clark Trail.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. The Thomas Jefferson Hour was created by the gentleman seated across from me now, Clay Jenkinson, and I think we're up to Jefferson 105. Jefferson the Revolutionary. Last week we talked about Jefferson the Builder, had a discussion about how he built his houses and where he built his house.
It's an interesting saga. We're trying to go back to basics, to walk through Jefferson's life with a particular emphasis on his letters, to sort of rethink him, to reintroduce him to the people who are longtime listeners of the Jefferson Hour, and to introduce Jefferson in this sort of basic biographical survey to people who are new listeners. And as you know, there are tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of those. And so it's always, for me, interesting to go back. As a humanities scholar, what I like to do is to dig in on something and then pull out all the way to sort of a lunar distance, or even the distance of Saturn or Jupiter, and look from a long way away at something that I thought I knew really well, and to try to synthesize information and summarize and reflect upon the trajectory of a life like that of Thomas Jefferson.
Well, it was very interesting, as I said earlier, to talk about Jefferson and his construction of Monticello. And we also spent some time talking about Jefferson and romance, his first wife. And where we left off, I think, was prior to him having any children. And he was married in 1772, and we talked about them being stranded in the snowstorm.
January 1st, 1772, down at the Forest, a plantation near Williamsburg. And then they made their way in a sort of leisurely fashion towards Monticello and staying with relatives and friends along the way, which was a very common way for honeymooners to behave at that time. And then when they came up towards Monticello, a blizzard, a rare Virginia snowstorm occurred, and they had to abandon the carriage. And the newlyweds then got on horses and rode up the mountain through what Jefferson describes as pretty heavy snow. And they got to this site. It was all potential. There was almost nothing there at the time. Jefferson had the mountain leveled, and he had built the first of a number of buildings. This was the Pavilion, the South Pavilion, which today is just a small appendage to the great Monticello, but it was the only thing that was there. And all of the servants and slaves were asleep. Jefferson was the sort who would not want to go wake anybody up. And so he and his newlywed wife, Martha, built a fire and cozied in their first night in their home. And Jefferson found part of a bottle or a bottle of wine behind some books on a bookshelf, and that enabled him to celebrate with Martha their homecoming. This was going to be the home that she lived in for the following 10 years until her death in 1782, and it would be the home that Jefferson would live in until his death on July 4th, 1826.
So the question I have to begin today's lesson, sir, would be, about Jefferson's political involvement. So 1772, he's married this wonderful woman. He's happy. He's at home, has his life before him. And, then in the year that followed began what I think are referred to as the intolerable acts. So my question to you, the Jefferson scholar, is, do you think in 1772 he was politically motivated? I know he was aware of all of these things going on around him, but do you think he anticipated any kind of a role in politics at that young age?
Certainly not a national role at that time. Jefferson was a Virginia squire, a gentleman. He had already been elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses. He could possibly have anticipated at some point being elected to the governorship of Virginia for a term or two. I don't think that Jefferson had any national aspirations at this time. I don't think that he thought of himself as a national figure. He was reluctant even to be a legislator within his own state, but he realized that there was a duty that one has to the community, if called upon, jury duty, or to be a legislator, or to be governor, or justice of the peace, or director of the local militia. And so he was certainly willing to do those things, but I think at this point, between 1772 and the time that the Revolution popped, that Jefferson saw himself as a private individual, as a man of letters, as a farmer, as an amateur scientist, and his interest was in having children and enjoying the company of his very beautiful and accomplished wife. I think he knew as early as 1772 that the struggle between the colonies and the mother country was unresolved. But I think if you had asked him in 1772, will this lead to rebellion and an independence movement, I think Jefferson would have said almost certainly not. We're good British citizens. All we're asking is for the crown and for the ministry and the parliament to respect our rights as British citizens. And if they do, we can probably work out the tensions that now exist. And if the crown and parliament and the ministry show us greater respect, then we'll be very happy to continue being colonies of Great Britain, that we have no inherent desire to be an independent nation.
So you said that he was elected to the House of Burgesses. Now, I think you have taught me that a Virginia planter in his position, it was almost expected that they would become part of the Virginia legislature, right?
I don't know how many planters there were, but let's say a few thousand. It might actually be closer to a few hundred of the larger planters. And not all of them would wind up doing anything particular. Some of them were drunks. Some of them were gamblers. Some of them just were exceedingly private. Some of them were not very well educated or very effective. You get all sorts of types of people. But all of the talented planters would be in a position probably to be called upon in some form or other to serve the Commonwealth. And it was clear almost from the beginning that Jefferson was an extremely talented young man, extremely talented in his learning, in his politeness, in his commitment to hard work. He was never one to shirk hard work, and that he had so much promise. At the same time, he was shy. He was a little insecure at this point. He certainly did not see himself as a revolutionary. There was none of the rebel in him. There was no Thomas Paine in him. There was no Patrick Henry in him. There was no Samuel Adams in him. Jefferson is a cerebral intellectual who understands the theory of human rights. He's read his John Locke, but he's not an instinctive troublemaker. In fact, just the opposite. Jefferson is instinctively a man who does not want to call public attention to himself in any way. And so he's about as unlikely a leader of the American Revolution as you could imagine.
You mentioned his knowledge of human rights, of studying John Locke, and I've often wondered, the life of a Virginia planter such as Thomas Jefferson, there was a lot of social activity, people who would come to visit and spend the day. And obviously, this would lead to a lot of conversation. I know you can only speculate, but when the gentlemen sat down after dinner to discuss things, I'm sure they talked about issues with local statutes and laws and how the plantation was running. But there must have been a fair amount of discussion about human rights, about forms of government, because, as you say, he was so well learned about these subjects.
I'm sure that there were such discussions, and the Virginians were aware that up north in Massachusetts Bay Colony, there were hotheads, and there was a great deal of ferment and discontentment, and that something was happening up north that hadn't really come to Virginia before. And they were watching this with some fascination, I think realizing that Virginia is very different from Massachusetts and vice versa. But they were aware of all of this. And beginning with the Stamp Act crisis in 1765, the Virginians were certain that there were unresolved issues of representation and proper colonial relations with the crown that had not been fully worked out yet. So let's assume for the moment that Jefferson is at one of these dinners or hosting one. Here's the thing you need to realize about this, David, that probably, let's say there are 8 or 9 men. The ladies have withdrawn. If the ladies are there, they, at a certain point when the dinner is finished, the ladies withdraw to what's called the withdrawing room or the drawing room. Now the men may smoke. Wine is beginning to circulate. Stories are told that would not be told in the presence of women. Subjects are broached which would not be broached in the presence of women. In the presence of women, political theory or the colony's concerns about the mother country were probably not discussed. But suddenly when the tablecloth had been removed and the women had removed themselves, there's a sort of loosening of the decorum. Even a dirty joke might be told at this point, ribald humor, some verses. There might be toastings, and somebody might start a political discussion. But if that discussion even began, the last person who would speak would be Thomas Jefferson. Everybody else would be talking and debating and arguing and having a really serious and playful and maybe a heated discussion. And then at some point someone would look over, and there was Jefferson just sitting there, clearly tracking everything that was happening, but not contributing because he was so fundamentally shy.
And there must be written accounts of this, I would
There are,
say.
yes.
Well, we need to take a short break. When we come back, let's delve into that further.
Thank you.
You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. I'm joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host this week, David Swenson, and we're talking about, how did you put it, Jefferson?
The reluctant revolutionary.
And, you know, it's very interesting to hear you talk about the dinner parties. You know me, I'm always interested in the personal interaction of these historical characters. And we had talked about him being the quiet one and waiting until everyone else had weighed in on their opinions and then bringing in the final judgment. And you said that there actually are written accounts of this.
Yeah, it may not even have been the final judgment that he was waiting for. When Jefferson went up to the Second Continental Congress and met John Adams and participated in it until the autumn of 1776 and then went back to Virginia, Adams, looking back on this many years later, said, during the whole time that Jefferson was in Congress, I never heard him say 3 sentences together. Mm-hmm. That he was this quiet genius. Everybody understood that there was something special about him.
That's what fascinates me. I interrupted you. I apologize. But that's what fascinates me is that they all knew that he was this, so he had some sort of a charisma that other people recognized, that they saw, because he didn't verbally express himself, but they knew.
His reputation had preceded him that he was a very serious student and scholar, and that he was a highly articulate man whose mind was extremely well organized. His arguments were not scattershot. His arguments were not impulsive. He wasn't somebody who spoke because he always wanted to be speaking. He's not somebody who waited for others to stop so that he could get in on the conversation. But he had this reputation of being a brilliant prose stylist and a deep scholar, especially of the history of politics and the history of liberty. I don't know that he had charisma, but he had something. Mm-hmm. And his silence was notable, and people sort of looked over at him. And he was elegant. He was always fastidious in his dress. He carried his body in a careful way. There was kind of a self-containment about Jefferson, but he was odd, and people didn't know quite what to make of him because he was in a group of alpha males who were all too happy to cross swords and to argue and to best each other in their boasts and toasts and insults and so on. And here's a man who wasted no words, who never thrust himself into any conversation, who held back, but at some point, if there was a fact that needed to be clarified, or if somebody were talking about Bolingbroke or Rousseau or Voltaire, and it was clear that they didn't really have much information, then maybe Jefferson would sort of slightly clear his throat and say, it may be interesting to all of you to know that when Rousseau wrote The Social Contract, these were the conditions in his life, and these were the conditions in France. And when you say that the argument was that the people are always right, certainly Rousseau felt that, but if you look at some of his other writings, he would have provided a very meek but authoritative corrective to whatever was not right about what he was hearing, or he would have supplied information that they needed but didn't have, or he would have reminded them of some precedent in Massachusetts history or Connecticut history or New York history or particularly Virginia history. But I've spoken longer in the answer to your question than he would ever have spoken in the whole course of his time in one of these gatherings or dinner parties. But he might have been saying, let me pour you some more of this wine. It's a Madeira, I know, but it's a very fine Madeira, and I think that you will see that it cleanses the palate beautifully. Or perhaps a little bit more dessert for you, sir. This dessert was made with a special meringue that I learned this from one of my correspondents in Scotland, and I've tried it a few times here at Monticello, and I think you'll find it completely pleasing. That's Jefferson. And so this is not, the point I keep wanting to make is, of all of the people that might have been looked upon by an outsider as the spark plug of an American revolutionary movement, nobody would have said, oh, there's that red-headed, tall planter in the back country of Virginia. If they said that, they would have been talking about Patrick Henry, who is just like a firebrand. You can count on Patrick Henry to be the most dominant person in any setting that he's ever in, and to say sharp, radical, provocative, sometimes reckless things.
Black and white, shades of gray.
But Jefferson is never going to do that. I know it sounds crazy, but Thomas Jefferson is a man who had no discernible ego. Of course, he had an ego. You can't be great and not have an ego. But he had no discernible ego. There was no hey, that was my idea, I think, that we were talking about. Or, when I first mentioned this 7 years ago, or I think what we should do is stop talking in this way. And that's somebody else. That's Patrick Henry or John Adams. It's not Jefferson. Jefferson spoke so quietly and with such a kind of self-depreciating lilt that people actually had to lean forward in their chairs to hear him. He never spoke up.
That's really interesting. What I'm left with from that is that he was not a judgmental person, not quick to judge things where those around him, and we certainly know that happens a lot in our society today. People are quick to judge, and poor Jefferson is the butt of a lot of that. But it sounds like he was the one who tempered these people that had reactionary judgments about politics, for instance.
Well, take John Adams, for example. In the famous musical 1776, they're always saying, "Sit down, John, sit down," because he's popping up. Point of order, wants to talk about things. Nobody else says things as well as he will say them. Everybody's wrong but John. He's been there before everybody else. He knows more about this than anyone. Why can't they understand what needs to be done? And he just has this. He said he was obnoxious, and he was obnoxious. But he was also an extremely important figure in the Revolution, probably a much more important figure than Thomas Jefferson was in the Revolution. But that's not Jefferson. I mean, Jefferson, we don't know this for sure, David, but at some point you think people, they reach some kind of an impasse in the conversation, and nobody's quite sure what to do next because maybe they're vague about some information, or maybe there are too many different mutually exclusive opinions on the table, and they reach the spot. I can just see then 3 or 4 people turning to the shy Virginian in the corner, and there he is, not even making eye contact. And then they would say, "Well, Mr. Jefferson, do you have any thoughts about this?" And then Jefferson would stammer a bit and say, "Well, I respect the discourse that I hear before me. You're all much more versed in all of this than I. You've played a more important role in all of this than I. But when I hear you say this, and then ground it in Cicero or Plutarch or Tacitus or Livy or Montesquieu, but never with any of the huff and puff of somebody who wants to be heard and believes that he's important, it's as if something has to be done to move the conversation. If called upon, he is willing to do what it takes to do it, but he will try to do it in such a way that no one's feelings are ever hurt and no one feels like Jefferson put him down or dismissed his point of view or was a know-it-all. There's a gentleness and a graciousness and a self-depreciation in it that disarms other people. But then when they go away, they think, that Jefferson is really an extraordinary mind. That is a very highly educated and intelligent man. And behind his softness of disposition, there is a very firm commitment to American rights with respect to the British government.
So here we have him, 1772, newly married, beginning the construction of this house, which is, he referred to, what was the famous statement about pulling up and tearing down?
Architecture is my delight, and putting up and pulling down are my favorite amusements.
So he was there, he was with the new wife, happy. I would assume at this point in his life, debt was not an overbearing issue. He'd by marriage, his wealth had increased in spite of the fact that it was always looming. It was not something. I guess the point I'm trying to make is it sounds like he was a pretty happy guy at this point. And then December 16th, 1773, the Boston Tea Party, and he was kind of pulled into the political world. Is that fair to say?
Slowly. So I think the portrait you paint of him is right. He's married. He's in love. He's building a new dream home on a mountain. He's planting orchards and gardens and vineyards, and he's thinking about maybe bringing in some buffalo from the west as in a deer park.
I didn't know that.
He wants that. He's going to have fountains and grottos. his brain, while everyone else is droning on about the Stamp Act, his brain is just all over the map. I'm going to do this. I'm going to create a grotto, and maybe I'll put some inscriptions in ancient Greek on it, and maybe we can get some moose or some antelope or some buffalo here. And when I build Monticello, I'm going to find a new and more efficient way to move the bricks. And cutting timbers is easier in July than it is in October. So he's actually marking down the number of bricks he's going to need for each wall. His brain is just constantly working in a wide variety of directions, and his private happiness, all of his life, was more important to him than public activity. He's not like Bill Clinton or even John Adams, who thirst for the public arena. Jefferson really did prefer private happiness. So he's first married, not to get too indelicate about it, but he's now fully engaged in a sexual life with a woman that he loves. His private life is completely compelling to him. And it's a bit of an annoyance to have to give some of his time, when there's so much to be done on the mountain, to public gatherings of ambitious men who like to cross swords and drink and posture. He sees them and he says, they never use one word when they can use two. They repeat themselves over and over and over again. One man stops and somebody hasn't even been listening and then says the same thing for a while. Then somebody finds some shade of difference and there's a public dispute for a while. For Jefferson, that's all just annoying. I wonder how I'm going to get window panes for the new house. Maybe I'll make a window that can kind of pivot on itself and I can open it up at different times. And we can make a triple sash window that'll have an insulating effect. And what if I had a dumbwaiter that could bring wine up from the basement? That's where his mind is. He's happy. His wife is pregnant. We know that Martha Jr., the first child, was born just a little over 9 months after his wedding. And so he's going to be a father. He's building an experimental house. He's going to graft different types of apples, and he's going to create a vineyard, and it'll be really the first serious vineyard in Virginia. And so this is Jefferson. And meanwhile, at the time when his private life is just beginning to find root, this sort of drum roll of the problems with Britain, the Stamp Act, and then the Intolerable Acts, and then the Townsend Acts. And
could you back up and just the Stamp Act goes back much farther.
1765.
Right, but for listeners and for me, could you just kind of give us an overview of that? Because it was nearly 10 years later that this public display in Boston Harbor happened, but that was related to the Stamp Act.
It cost Britain something to maintain her colonies. It was expensive. And Britain was benefiting economically from the colonies, but that didn't necessarily bring money to the public treasury in Britain. And after the French and Indian War, which was a world war between France and her clients and Britain and her clients, some of which was fought out in North America, that's why it's called the French and Indian War, and which ended with the British taking possession of Canada and banishing the French essentially from the New World, a very expensive conflict on several continents. And Britain had shouldered the burden of winning that war, protecting its American colonies and their interests from France. When the war ended, Britain was bankrupt. And British ministers were called upon to find some way to recover the economics of Great Britain. And one of the things they decided to do was to tax the colonies. And one easy way to do it was to tax certain items. So legal documents, stamps had to be placed on legal documents, playing cards, a whole range of things, newspapers. Britain was trying to find a revenue source to recoup losses from the French and Indian War and to put the colonial finance on a more equitable footing. So they did all these things. And the mistake that they made was that they didn't consult the colonies. They just did it. And so when this happened in 1765, the colonies were struck by wrath, deeply offended, because one of the basic rights of being a British citizen, going back almost to the Magna Carta, is that you cannot be taxed without your consent. The basis of being a free English citizen is that you can only be taxed by your consent, meaning by representatives from amongst yourself voting for that tax. And here was Britain from 3,000 miles away simply imposing these taxes and saying, we have your interests in mind. Don't worry. Trust us. We need the revenue. We're not trying to hurt you. You're virtually represented in Parliament anyway. Just calm down. Don't get so easily aroused by all of this. This is a simple way for us to fix the fiscal problems of England. And by the way, it's time for you to start paying some of your share of colonial maintenance. So please understand that this is not an act of tyranny. This is a fiscal measure.
And the British taxed certain items and also regulated trade, did they not? You have to trade with English merchants.
Right.
The
orders in council were always that you can't. Things have to travel in British bottoms.
So the way I read this is that this drew Jefferson into politics.
A little. He was just a kid at the time, and he saw Patrick Henry in the Capitol making his famous Stamp Act speech. But then it went away.
But after this thing happened in Massachusetts, Jefferson called for a day of fasting. And to me, now you tell me if I'm wrong, but to me that's a mark in his political career and political standing.
You're flashing forward to the Boston Tea Party crisis. Right. So 1765 was the year of the Stamp Act crisis, and it flashed, and then it sort of went away. Mm-hmm. And then in 1773, the Tea Party occurs in Massachusetts Bay, in which terrorists, colonial terrorists dressed up like Native Americans, board a British tea ship and dump hogsheads and other vessels of tea unceremoniously into the harbor. The British were so appalled by that they closed the harbor and began to put serious economic pressure on the people of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And at that point, the other colonies got involved, and Jefferson was asked, he didn't suggest this, but he was asked to write a resolution calling for a day of fasting and prayer in solidarity with our suffering brethren up in Massachusetts.
And Virginia's royal governor did not like this.
Whenever the Virginians did something that the royal governor didn't like, he closed the House of Burgess, sent them home, and did this on this occasion. Which
led to this meeting, I believe it was at the Apollo Tavern. That's going to have to wait till
the
after
Apollo
the break.
Room at the Raleigh Tavern.
Right. So we'll be back in just a moment to discuss that. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. I'm your host this week, David Swenson, and I'm joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. And we were talking about the Stamp Act of 1765. My understanding is that the British government imposed harsher regulations at that time, and And that was what caused, as you call, the terrorists of Massachusetts.
They were terrorists, and one of the things that's always a little bit bothered me about this is that Samuel Adams and his merrymakers who threw the tea into the bay dressed up like American Indians. And so, knowing what we now know from 300 years of oppression of Native Americans, to think that they disguised themselves as Indians, it just troubles me a little bit. That it's not that I don't think they expected that the Indians would be blamed for this, but it was convenient for them to appropriate an Indian identity on this occasion. And so just that as a little footnote, let me quickly summarize. So we're leaving out a lot of things here, David, but it doesn't matter. So you have these rising tide of colonial discontentment. And before that, it was Massachusetts, or it was Georgia, or it was Virginia, or it was New York. But suddenly, after the Boston Tea Party, there is sort of a national movement to have a unified response to what is perceived as British tyranny. And so committees of correspondence are begun. Actually, Virginia was the state that called for committees of correspondence. They were basically saying we should have a social networking system so that we can stay in touch with people of like minds in other places, and they can update us and send out letters which will effectively serve as newsletters so that we can all keep current with where things are and help each other out through this. And so Jefferson is this quiet, shy man who is recently married and is fixated on his private happiness, but who has served in the Virginia House of Burgesses. And suddenly this revolutionary tide, or the deepening discontentment, begins to grow stronger and more national and more powerful. And so sometime between 1773 and 1774, Jefferson becomes a revolutionary. And he's been reading about these things ever since his mentor, William Small, began to put those books in front of him when he was a college student. And then he continued that research when he was reading law with George Wythe. So he is about as well grounded in the texts of the Enlightenment, D'Holbach, Rousseau, Voltaire, Bolingbroke, all of these people. He's deeply embedded in this tradition of the Enlightenment's commitment to the rights of man and to social compacts and to the consent of the governed and so on. And so probably nobody in America is better read on these subjects and has really figured out what it all means more than Jefferson. But he's this private individual. And these public crises then find their way to him. And when they do, he writes this pamphlet. He writes his own sort of, unasked by anyone else, he writes an essay about what it all means and what our relationship is with the British Crown and how much self-government colonists ought to have, and what does the colonizing of Virginia have to do, say, with the coming of Anglo-Saxons from across the English Channel in the ancient eras of British history, and so on. So he begins to write this essay. He finishes it, and he's supposed to take it down himself to Williamsburg to a meeting of the House of Burgesses and the hotheads down in Williamsburg. But it's so typical of Jefferson as he begins to make his way from Monticello down to the capital, he gets sick. Jefferson has stress-related illnesses all of his life. When he's in particular stress, he gets what we call migraines. It's not quite clear what they actually were, and medical historians now doubt that they were truly migraines, but he gets what he calls his periodical headache, and it incapacitates him. He has to go into a room and shut all the doors and windows and make no noise and just sit there from dawn until dusk. So it bears resemblance to migraines. And later on in his life, he got serious digestive issues. In fact, his digestive issues when he was president were so severe that he consulted doctors, including Benjamin Rush, about this, and he actually thought that his digestive problems, some sort of colitis or irritable bowel syndrome, was going to shorten his life. So Jefferson is a very sensitive plant, and he stresses easily, and he loves regularity and rigor and control and discipline. And whenever things spin out of control, he has these little miniature nervous episodes, which are maybe psychosomatic, but they certainly have a physiological component. And so he's on his way to Williamsburg with this essay, which is the most revolutionary thing that has been written by an American colonist up to date. And he gets sick. And so he sends it along with somebody else and goes back to Monticello. And the people down in Williamsburg read this. They decide to call it a summary view, and they decide to publish it. And so they do. And it is radical. Jefferson's argument is that we are a commonwealth, that we don't owe any particular allegiance to the British Parliament, that our allegiance is to the king. The king is the overarching sovereign over all of the British Empire, that Parliament has no right to regulate us, tax us, or govern us without our consent, that our allegiance is to the crown only, and that the crown should treat us as part of a global commonwealth and should do everything in its power to allow us to govern ourselves. And Jefferson says, and by the way, of course, Britain has undertaken some expense in protecting and maintaining the colonies, but let me remind you that when our ancestors left Britain, they voluntarily came over to the New World. They weren't really being subsidized. They came over with their own gumption, and with very little or no help from the British, they built a society here, and it's our society that we don't bear any more a special allegiance to Britain than the Anglo-Saxons bore to the German lowlands from which they came over to England around the time of the millennium.
I find that a bit of a stretch.
Well, of course it's a stretch, but Jefferson and Jefferson says, and by the way, the true source of liberty is not ancient Greece and Rome. It's the Anglo-Saxon farms and little townships called hundreds in Northern Europe. So what Jefferson did in the summary view was go one step beyond our discontentment with Parliament. He put the king on notice and said, the king is more a creature of his society than society is his subject. And if the king does not behave in a fair-minded way, protecting all of the interests of his global empire equally, we will reject his sovereignty and authority.
Getting back to Jefferson, I look at this as so significant because it's his first published work. Now, that's tempered somewhat by knowing that he didn't actually present the paper and somebody else decided to publish it. But still,
he would probably have tried to revise it or prevent its publication or make it anonymous. Or it was a radical document. It was extremely well written, as you say. There are some whoppers in it from a purely historical point of view.
Well, I wouldn't use the word whoppers,
but other people recognized its usefulness, and they published it, and it was very widely circulated. In fact, it got Jefferson in trouble in Britain. He was put on a watch list in Britain because of the radical nature of this pamphlet. And then because of this moment, and I'm trying to describe this sort of confluence. It's like the confluence of the Yellowstone and the Missouri.
I'm with you.
This confluence of the private, hesitant planter, man of letters, and scientist.
Odd fellow.
This eccentric genius who doesn't have any notable ambition. With the growing crisis between the colonies and Great Britain, this confluence comes to Jefferson after the Stamp Act crisis, and he writes this document voluntarily. No one asked him to do it. And when it was published, without his knowledge, it became a famous document, not only in the United States, but to a certain degree in England. And if he had not written the summary view in 1774, it is certain that he would not have been the author of the Declaration of Independence.
And it gave him status as a revolutionary, deserved or not, desired or not. It all of a sudden, it built his reputation and his name.
So you have someone like Patrick Henry spouting off all the time, speaking in cliches, and he's a hothead. He's speaking in bromides. He says radical and provocative things. They have a great emotional appeal, but there's not a lot of intellectual scaffolding under them. And suddenly there's an alternative. There is this brilliant, quiet, rational figure who is writing a historically grounded account of the rights of the colonial people of the United States in language that's strong and clear and firm, but there's no bombast in it. There's nothing. Jefferson's not a rhetorical provocateur like Henry. And so people say, wow, this guy is not only more radical than almost anybody, but Jefferson is also an extremely able scholar and writer. We're going to use that talent. He might not be the person you put up at the barricades with his musket. He may not be the fiery orator who arouses the crowd during the summer picnic, but this guy has another genius, a capacity that we are going to need in order to secure our independence, or at least our rights, in the crisis that we're in. And so suddenly people are beginning to hear of this strange, red-headed Virginia intellectual, and he's elected as an alternate, not as a primary delegate, but an alternate to the Second Continental Congress.
Well, before we go there, it's September 1774.
Summer review time.
And then things really, especially for that time, even for our time, things started to move quickly. So there was a call for a First Continental Congress, and
he's not at that one.
He's not at that one, but it's a big deal.
John Adams, Samuel Adams.
They boycott British goods, which is well, you give me.
There's an economic boycott, and they realize how grave this is. They
have their feet in it now, right?
They name a tall Virginian by the name of George Washington to be the commander-in-chief of the Continental armies, which, by the way, don't exist. But they have decided this may wind up in armed conflict. Things are moving in that direction. This is not going to be something that we can work out on the basis of petitions and remonstrations and days of fasting and prayer. Not everyone's on board with this, David. I mean, the majority of the American people are probably unaware of what's going on at all. Of those that are aware of this, most people want to work things out with Britain. Most people are not thinking independence at this time. Only a handful of
and war
people
was far out of people's minds, I would assume.
No one thought this would come to war.
Right.
And so things are moving pretty quickly, but
it's based in economics.
Yeah, that's the thing, So you could say if you were – I remember when I was studying at Oxford University, I had a friend who was studying British history, and he and I had this wonderful evening together where he told me the British view of the American Revolution, that –
oh, please share that.
Here are a bunch of little hotheads in Massachusetts who don't want to pay their just taxes, and that they instead of just making that the issue, they talk about the rights of man and humankind and the aspirations of humanity, and they trot out all this specious logic because they're tax resistors. They're people who don't want to pay their fair share of maintaining their own colonial system. And the British are bending over backwards. They withdraw the Stamp Act, and they lighten the Townshend Acts and the Intolerable Acts. They keep bending over to accommodate the colonists, and the colonists are never satisfied because they want their cake and eat it too. They want all the benefits of having the British Navy protect them in the high seas. They want all the benefits of belonging to the British trade network in the world, and they want to pay none of the costs of being part of that great empire. And so from a British point of view, they're just hotheads, and particularly in Massachusetts. And that's why when all of this heated up, John Adams, who was another kind of genius, took the lead in getting Washington to be the commander-in-chief because he wanted a Virginian to do that. He wanted the world to see it wasn't just Massachusetts. It wasn't just Boston. And when the Declaration of Independence came, he himself named Jefferson to be the principal author of it because he said he wanted a Virginian to be at the head of this business. In other words, John Adams knew that it really was about Massachusetts effectively, because Virginia didn't have that kind of an economy. Virginia didn't have trade ships. But if it were just a Massachusetts tax revolt, it would not succeed. So Adams wanted to incorporate people from around the whole colonial system, and particularly the most populous state and the most powerful state and the largest state, Virginia. And in doing so, then, he would overcome the public relations issue that this was really just Boston and the Bay. That was another act of great leadership, and Jefferson got the Declaration of Independence for those two reasons. He had written a summer review, and Adams wanted a Virginian to be the draftsman.
Just to back up and recap, the First Continental Congress is in September 1774. Jefferson is not there. The two largest accomplishments of that First Continental Congress, as I see it, were the boycotting of British goods and to plan for a Second Continental Congress, which was supposed to be in May 1775, but something happened in April of 1775 that changed things dramatically.
Suddenly, the war broke out. So you have two small skirmishes at Lexington in Massachusetts and at Concord in Massachusetts. And as Emerson later said, that was the shot heard round the world. And suddenly what had been this political standoff, a kind of a Cold War of economic policy between Britain and the United States, flashed into armed struggle. And now the United States was born, in a sense, at Concord in the spring of 1775.
And the Second Continental Congress occurred, but Jefferson wasn't there.
He was an alternate. He was home in Virginia, and when another member had to return, Jefferson reluctantly went up to Philadelphia to serve in the Second Continental Congress. He did not particularly want to do this because, as he said all of his life, I am a Virginian first and an American second. And when he spoke of my country, Jefferson invariably meant Virginia, and so he thought that the arena of the Revolution, at least as he saw it, was going to be in his own state at Williamsburg, and that whatever was going on up in Philadelphia was of lesser importance, and that he would be, in a sense, taking himself out of the arena of action into a periphery if he went to Philadelphia. But he did, and marched into history as the author of the Declaration of Independence. That's it for Jefferson 105, the Reluctant Revolutionary. Next time on Jefferson 106, we shall talk about the writing of the Declaration of Independence. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public Radio. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any past show for a $12 donation, please call 888-828-2853. Again, that number is 888-828-2853. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.org and on iTunes. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.org. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Music by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.